Hey everyone, what this one is going to be focused on today is really, if you use the if you're using the AMSCO book, we are looking at part of what's covered in chapter 27 of AMSCO and part of what's covered in chapter 28. Okay, should be review, and then some of it will be new information that you will get in 28 this week. Okay, so basically what I'm going to try to do is cover the civil rights movements for African Americans, for LGBT Americans, women, and Native Americans as they're occurring in the mid 20th century. Okay, and really just hitting on the big pieces to know. Okay, so let's dive into African American civil rights. Okay. So we really begin this journey if we scroll back really through history to the right after the Civil War and Reconstruction. And you know that as a result of, or you should remember, as a result of the Compromise of 1877, we pulled all federal troops out of the South, and that ended Reconstruction. Okay, that's what Rutherford B. Hayes said he would do in order to get elected. That commission, or he made that dirty deal that said, yeah, in the Compromise of 1877, yeah, I'll pull troops out of the South if you make me president, basically is what happened. And so that's exactly what happened. And once that happened, protections for African Americans were basically gone. We would see the rise of the KKK in the South. We would see the Black Codes. With Plessy versus Ferguson, we would see separate but equal. And really, for almost 100 years, there's not a whole lot of progress that's made for African Americans in the South. It's not until the presidency of Harry Truman in the late 1940s and early 1950s that we begin to see some movement. Now, I will say that Harry Truman wanted to do more than what he was able to do. But unfortunately, he was not able to get Congress to really work with him. So one of the big things that Truman's known for is that he desegregated the armed forces. Just prior to the Korean War in 1950, this was done. And now for the first time, you would no longer have separate black units and separate white units. Okay, now they're going to be all in one. Okay. The second thing that Harry Truman would push for was the Fair Employment Practice Commission. Okay. Basically, this was his way of trying to create some type of federal agency that would prevent employers from discriminating or hiring in discrimination in the hiring of African Americans. Unfortunately, it was blocked in Congress by Southern Democrats, who are going to be the ones who are frequently blocking legislation in Congress. While really up until the 1960s, until LBJ comes into power. So Truman was not able to get as much done. And if you think back to Truman's Fair Deal, there are three big things that are part of Truman's Fair Deal, and civil rights is one of them. Education is another, and healthcare is another. Those are things to definitely remember. His Fair Deal, and this is what he tries to do with civil rights. He tries for a greater Civil Rights Act, but he's just not able to do that. And so, what we do see Truman able to do is desegregate the armed forces. So, I guess what I would call the catalyst of the African American civil rights movement is Emmett Till. And actually, just by happen chance this morning, I was perusing on streaming because, you know, we're all stuck at home right now. And I was looking at Amazon and I found this documentary on Emmett Till. And of course, you know, being the weird history teacher nerd that I am, I was like, oh, I think I'm going to watch that. And I even learned some new things this morning that I didn't realize. So, can anyone tell me what you already know about Emmett Till? You can just throw it into the chat, because I'm curious to know, like, what background you have. Maybe some of you that had AP Gov with me, or maybe others from your own other history. So I see that someone saying, Kaden, you're saying he was brutally murdered. Okay, yeah, but so were many other African Americans. So why do we remember Emmett Till of the thousands that were lynched? Okay. Yeah. Okay. He was lynched wrongfully for looking at a white woman in a store. Yeah. Good. 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 Um, yeah. So you guys are all kind of hitting around the point. So Emmett Till's a teenager, probably pretty close to your age, who lives in the North, and he asked his mother for the summer to go to the South to stay with his uncle and his cousins in Mississippi. And he does go to the South, and even though she's a little bit concerned about it, and one day they go into it's Bryant's like grocery store, okay, like a little mom and pop shop owned by the Bryant's family. And supposedly the story goes, Emmett Till bought this pack of bubble gum, and Miss Bryant was the cashier. As Emmett Till was leaving, and in the documentary I just saw, his cousin who was with him admitted to this. As Emmett Till was leaving, he gave a whistle to Miss Bryant, who was white. And everybody but Emmett Till was scared at that point, because they all basically knew that, whoops, that's a no-go. You don't do that. A few nights later, Emmett Till's uncle would have a knock at the door in the middle of the night. There were a couple white men there who said they wanted him and basically kidnapped him from the house. What ended up happening was horrendous. They took him to a barn in town where they tortured him. They beat him mercilessly, and murdered him before throwing him in the river there in town. And it would be several days later before his body was discovered in the river. The mutilation to his body was absolutely just, there are just no words for it. They took an axe and split his skull open. They cut off his ears. They sliced down through his nose multiple times. They cut the center of his tongue and pulled it out. They removed his genitalia. It is just like, murder is obviously unexcusable and obviously terrible, and lynching is horrendous in of itself and terrible. But this is just at a whole other level. And there's an eyewitness who was near the barn who could hear the screams and torture of Emmett for quite some time. But basically, using the term from another civil rights movement, in the South, it was don't ask, don't tell. You don't. If something's happening to a black person, you keep your eyes and ears off of that to protect yourself. And so he ends up being brutally murdered. His mother has the casket shipped back, because what they actually try to do is they actually try to bury the casket with Emmett Till's body in Mississippi. And at the last minute, because they're trying to cover it up, at the last minute, they order the body to be sent back to his mother in Chicago. And so the body sent back to Mamie Till, his mother, and she when she gets there, she describes the horrific smell before she even gets in the building where the body's at. And she comes up to the casket, and the casket is literally nailed shut. And she says, "Open it. I want a hammer." And tells the funeral director, "If you won't open it, I'm going to open it." So they open it, and what they discover, I'm going to show you a picture here. This is really horrendous. So if it's not something you want to see, maybe just remove your screen for a second. What they discover is this. And Mamie Till, as a result, just says, "Enough's enough." The world, and the United States especially, needs to see this. They need to see where we're at in terms of the civil rights movement, and what is happening to innocent African Americans, especially innocent African American children in the United States as a result of this racial hatred. And she makes a decision, and she says, the funeral director says, I can do some stuff with the face. We can close the casket, etc. Blah, blah, blah. And she says, no, this will be an open casket funeral. I want people to see what was done to my son. And that's exactly what happens. They have to have a service that goes on for more than 3 days because thousands and thousands of people line up to come and view this casket in Emmett Till's body. It ends up going on Life magazine and becomes published nationwide as a result. And people are just horrified by what they see at this funeral. And that's Mamie Till at the casket of Emmett Till. This is really the event that launches the entire civil rights movement, because people are like, enough is enough. Now, what happens to the 2 men accused of his murder? Well, they're put on trial. And what do you think happens to them? Yeah, nothing is exactly right. They're acquitted. The jury goes back and debates for about 45 minutes after the trial. And apparently what actually happened was they were done and they made their decision, their unanimous decision that they were innocent within a few minutes, but they were encouraged to stay back there longer so that it would appear that they were taking more time to decide. And so they just drank beers in the back of this room until about 45 minutes had passed, and then came out with their decision that it was innocent. Now, the 2 men that were accused of murdering a couple years later would go on record, because when a magazine paid them for their story, and actually admitted to the murder and explained what they did. But of course, because of double jeopardy, they weren't able to be tried. So the next big thing in the civil rights movement, of course, is Brown versus Board of Education. And I'm not really going to spend a ton of time on this because I'm guessing you should probably have a pretty good understanding of this. So in 1954, the NAACP finally was able to get the Supreme Court to hear the case Brown versus Board of Education, aiming to desegregate schools. In this landmark decision under the Warren Court, the court basically reversed Plessy versus Ferguson, which, if you remember back to the late 1800s, had established the doctrine of separate but equal. The court said, no longer is the case. All those public facilities that are separate equal, no more, but especially schools. A year later, schools in the South were still not desegregating. And so they had a second case, which was known as Brown 2. And at that point, the courts just ordered that all of this desegregation needed to be done with all deliberate speed. Now, Southern schools ended up putting all sorts of stops in place, reasons why, excuses, etc., why they couldn't desegregate or why it would take years. I mean, in some cases, it took decades, okay? There were schools still being desegregated in the late 80s and early 90s across the South. Meanwhile, the Southern Democrats in Congress wrote the Southern Manifesto, which basically said, yeah, we're not going to follow through with this decision and try to make us. And that's the problem with the Supreme Court. If you took AP Gov, you remember that the Supreme Court can make decisions, but at the end of the day, they don't have any enforcement power. And so it becomes a problem. So like in the case of Little Rock High School and Little Rock, Little Rock, Arkansas, President Eisenhower actually had to send in troops to allow for 9 African Americans to attend school there because they were the Arkansas National Guard was blocking them from attending school. So that's really the craziness of how the South resisted what was going on. The next big event is you get the Montgomery Bus Boycott. So in general, understand that travel for African Americans is not very safe across the United States. And if African Americans wanted to travel from, say, New York to New Orleans, okay, I'm just giving a random example, they had to be incredibly careful once they entered the South because there would be places where they could and could not stop and not be in danger. So one of the things that was published was what was called the Green Book, or the Negro Motorist Green Book. And basically what this is, I actually have a copy in my classroom, is a listing of all the different cities and such all along major highways across the United States, but especially in the South, and places that it was safe for African Americans to stop, okay, whether it be for gasoline, whether it be to eat, whether it be to, go to a motel, rest, etc. But many African Americans from the period will tell the stories of how they would have to go, they'd have to strategically plan their trips because, there'd only be certain gas stations that they could stop. Or there would be no restrooms anywhere that they could stop. So they would have to, pull off on the side of the road, etc. In Montgomery, Alabama, which was really one of the hotbeds of the civil rights movements, the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which African Americans are using heavily to get around, buses, excuse me. It really kicks off when Rosa Parks, a young Black woman, decides to sit at the front of the bus, which is a whites only area because of separate but equal, all of that. She, of course, is removed from the bus and arrested because she refuses to go to the Black section in the back. As a result, this launches the Montgomery Bus Boycott. A new civil rights leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., comes onto the stage, basically the national stage, as a advocate and spokesperson for the civil rights movement, and begins to encourage, he actually goes to Montgomery, encourages people not to use the bus system, to boycott the bus system, to cause an economic hardship for the city. And eventually the result of that is the desegregation of the buses as well too. We then start to see all sorts of nonviolent protests, because really that's the philosophy of Dr. King, is that we utilize peaceful non-resistance. We are not going to fight violence with violence, okay? We're going to biblically turn the other cheek. And so organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC is what it was called, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was what Dr. King was head of, the SCLC, two organizations that are going to be important to remember, start holding trainings for people, African Americans and whites who are part of this movement, in terms of how to non-violently protest. And so they start doing things like sit-ins, which you see here at the Woolworth, which was an old soda shop, like a old lunch counter, in Greensboro, North Carolina, where they sit in and literally refuse to move from that counter, which was a whites-only counter. And you can see people just poured drinks on them, poured salt on them, in some cases actually physically ripped them out of the chairs and were abusive towards them. And they just had to sit there and not do anything, because the idea is the minute that we start fighting back with violence, it's going to be used against us. So sit-ins were a big thing that were utilized as a nonviolent protest. The next thing we get is the Birmingham Children's Crusade. And I actually want to show you a clip of this because this is what's seen on national TV. And so this is the first time I've been live streaming where I've used a live clip. So bear with me for a second, because what I want to do is show you what people saw on national TV, and I need to fast forward through this. So just give me 1 second.
Martin Luther King Jr. came to Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 on a mission to a place.
This is not going to be fun because of how this little thing at the bottom keeps coming up.
And put in jail, lost jobs.
Okay, here's what I wanted.
We felt we had to do.
The brutal crackdown was widely televised, and images of the event were seen around the world. Robert Corley says this incident galvanized new support for the civil rights movement.
It was really that children's crusade that really turned the tide, because it did serve the goal of filling up the jails and forcing the white community to come to the table with King and negotiate some sort of settlement.
Eventually, King and Birmingham city leaders reached an agreement. Within months, the local segregation laws were abolished. Reverend Wood says King's determination to keep the movement going made all the difference.
but we would not have accomplished what we did if it had not been for the support and leadership that Dr. King brought.
The Birmingham campaign was a climactic battle of the civil rights movement. For many, it stands as an iconic symbol of the sacrifices made by King and thousands of African Americans. Chris Simpkins, VOA News, Birmingham, Alabama.
So you saw some of those clips there. There's another one, but I'm not going to be able to get to it because of this stupid thing here at the bottom of the screen. But basically what happened is Dr. King then moved to, I mean, not physically moved, but went to Birmingham, Alabama to launch the next phase of the civil rights movement, because Birmingham was one of the most segregated cities in the South. And he led a march there. And as a result of him leading a march, he was thrown in jail. And during his time in jail, he would write the letter from Birmingham Jail, which is a foundational document for those of you that take AP Gov, and is basically the idea that he was laying out his principles of the civil rights movement and peaceful non-resistance, because he had learned from people like Gandhi and human history. And so he writes this letter and puts that, that we're going to fight back utilizing the bonds of Christian love. We're not going to meet fist with fist, etc. President Kennedy sees that letter, and it really does move President Kennedy to start to push for civil rights legislation. Meanwhile, while King and so many are in jail from the Birmingham March, the children in Birmingham, Alabama, the black children, lead their own crusade, which is why it's often called the Children's Crusade. A few days later, they literally get up out of schools and they shut the city down, okay? Anyways, what ends up happening is that the city officials turn the fire hoses on them, which are strong enough to remove the bark from trees. So you can imagine how painful that was. They utilize police dogs on them, and they basically terrorize these children and fill the jails up with kids as well too. And like you saw in that video clip that I showed you, what ended up happening is that Birmingham agreed to end some of the some of the segregation practices that were in place there. So they were successful in Birmingham as well too. So as a result of all these things, LBJ would sign the Civil Rights Act in 1964. It was a bill that was started by JFK, but of course JFK was assassinated, and so LBJ came to the plate, and that was really what he said is, the way to honor LBJ is by the immediate passage of the Civil Rights Act. So basically what it does is it bans racial discrimination in public places. It forbid racial discrimination in employment. It created the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, which is what Truman had wanted but was not able to get. LBJ was able to finally to get. And it authorized the Justice Department to kind of be the law enforcement agency to ensure that these things occurred. And so the Civil Rights Act was a major victory for African Americans, but it's not the end, because we still have a voting problem. So now that you've gotten rid of separate but equal, at least on paper, it's still going to take years for them to do. But the problem is that we still have a problem with voting rights. And so that's going to be the next phase of the civil rights movement, and Dr. King is voting rights. So another city's chosen, and this time it's Selma. And why Selma? Because in Selma, blacks made up 50% of the population, but only 1% of registered voters. Why? Because of things like literacy tests and poll taxes and grandfather clauses and all these other things that we've talked about that prevented people from being able to vote. And so basically what they did was they were leading a march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, the capital. And it was a symbolic march to the Capitol to then at the Capitol demand for voting rights and demand to be registered to vote. And so what ends up happening is the first time they march, again, it's caught on national TV, the Alabama State Police brutally go after these marchers. They utilized whips off of horseback. They gassed them. They beat them, as you're seeing in that top picture there. And once again, it's caught on national TV. So as a result, many people from the North flood to Selma, including whites from the North who want to be part of this movement. And Dr. King himself comes to Selma. And once again, after several people being murdered, including a white priest from the North, they march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge all the way to Montgomery, Alabama, where George Wallace is governor, who's an incredible racist in of himself. And they end up demanding for the voting legislation. And because so many people saw the horrific events on Selma, they pressed the government. And LBJ then introduced the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So what the Voting Rights Act did was it banned literacy tests in states and basically removed anything that was preventing people, especially black people, from being able to register to vote. It empowered the Justice Department to have federal registrars who could actually go to those areas and ensure that African Americans were being able to have the right to vote, as well as a couple other executive type functions where they were being enforced. Okay, so the Voting Rights Act happens, and that's a major victory in the civil rights movement. Of course, in American history, we do a lot of comparing and contrasting, and you can't talk about the African American civil rights movement without talking about Malcolm X and Black Power. Malcolm X is another major leader of the African American civil rights movement, but he criticizes King because he believes that King, through his peaceful non-resistance movement, is really subservient to whites. And instead, Malcolm X and the Black Muslims advocate for self-defense and to meet fist with fist, if that's what it takes. So a more violent take on it. Eventually, he would leave the Black Muslims, and he would actually move away from defending violence. But he was assassinated by his opponents in 1965, the same year of the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Some advocated for Black Power, which was extreme separatism, where they basically said, forget the whites, let's just have all of our own institutions, our own banks, our own stores, etc., our own political parties, write our own history, all that. And you also get the rise after the death of Malcolm X of the Black Panthers, who basically were like a revolutionary socialist movement advocating for self-rule of blacks. Okay, and so that's the opposite side of the civil rights movement. Fortunately, at least in my opinion, the peaceful non-resistance side is what ended up stealing the day. And Martin Luther King's vision would end up working, and people around the United States that prior to the 1960s were not necessarily in favor of African American civil rights were favorable after all these things they continue to see. Really, the media plays an outstanding and incredible role in the civil rights movement. Had they not been there for Emmett Till, had they not been there for Birmingham and for Selma, I don't know that the rest of the nation would have gotten on board as quickly as they did. Okay, so the other thing that we get out of LBJ in the 1960s is affirmative action. So in 65, he signed Executive Order 11246. It's not a number that you need to remember, so don't worry about that. And basically what it said was that anyone that was a federal contractor, so that it was employed by the federal government or was doing a project for the federal government, especially construction companies, was no longer allowed to discriminate in employment on the basis of race, color, sex, and national origin. It also required them to take affirmative action against employment discrimination, okay, by hiring and devising and implementing plans to increase the participation of minorities and of women in their workplace. So basically the idea is that you need to actively work to try to hire more minorities. It's not just African Americans, but other minorities as well too, and more women in the workforce that you have. So this has become an incredibly debated topic. It was then, it still is today. It ends up being a major Supreme Court case, which if you've taken AP Gov, you should remember, in Regents University of California versus Bakke, because Bakke was a white man who was applying for medical school. He had one of the highest percentile scores on the MCAT, the score or the test you had to take in order to get into medical school. And he was denied entrance. Why? Because they brought in other African Americans due to affirmative action to try to balance out the class, even though they didn't have as good of scores as he did on his admission criteria and his MCAT test. So Bakke takes him to court, and basically what the Supreme Court says is that affirmative action is fine and good. You can certainly use race as a factor in your decision as to whether or not to admit a student at the college level into a program, but it can't be the only factor. So you have to utilize other factors as well too. Race can't be the only one. And so as a result, Bakke wins the case, okay? Again, affirmative action is still a big thing today. Is it used today? It absolutely is still used today, especially with colleges, but it can't be the only thing in their decision. So they can't just bring someone into the university because their race is X. They have to use it as one of many factors when considering whether or not to bring someone into their university. Then we, in the 1960s, see the relaunch of the women's movement, which had kind of gone silent since the 19-teens, when women like Alice Paul were pushing for the right to vote. We really have three different stages of the women's movement in American history. The second is after the first is after the Second Great Awakening, okay? Why does the women's movement launch after the Second Great Awakening? Why does the women's movement launch after the Second Great Awakening? Curious to see if people can tell me this correctly, because it's so important to know. Why does the women's movement launch after the Second Great Awakening? You're hitting around it. What is the legacy of the Second Great Awakening? Because you're right, they are involved in their church, and you are right that they argue that religion supports equality. Temperance isn't the legacy of the Second Great Awakening, okay? What's the legacy of the Second Great Awakening? Reform. Reform is the answer. Remember, out of the Second Great Awakening, women, especially in these churches, are really charged up, and they want to reform many of the ails of society. So besides women's rights, what other reforms, and temperance was already said here, what other reforms come out of the Second Great Awakening? Prison and asylum reforms, yep, Dorothea Dix, good. Another really big one. Yeah, education reform does come out of that, but there's a really, really, really big one, 1800s. What is it? Abolition, yeah. Abolition is the big one that's a reform movement that comes out of the Second Great Awakening. And women are really at the heart of all these different reform movements. So we see the push for women's rights in the early 1800s with the Seneca Falls Convention, the Declaration of Sentiments, etc. Then really it's abolition and the Civil War that take over for some time. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, we see the second women's rights movement. Sorry, my voice is just like given out. And in the second women's rights movement, they're pushing for the right to vote, which they finally get after World War I, because during World War I, they proved to be such a invaluable part of the economy because they fill all these jobs at the factories that men aren't able to fill because they're fighting. And so they get the passage of the 19th Amendment. And then the third women's movement really starts in the 1960s. And it's really launched as a result of this woman in this book that you're seeing here, when Betty Friedan writes the book, The Feminine Mystique. And basically the idea behind the feminine mystique was that it was encouraging women to seek fulfillment in professional careers. She's basically saying we don't have to have this cult of domesticity. That's a term from earlier in APUSH that you should still remember. This ideal that a woman is the master of the home, that she's the homemaker, and that she educates the children in the home, yada, yada, yada. She's saying that, look, if that's what you want to do, you want to be a homemaker, that's all fine and good. But if you want to seek out a professional career, then go and do it. You should have that ability. And that's really what the feminine mystique puts out. Betty Friedan is then going to help organize the National Organization for Women, or NOW, which is then going to take a more activist role in pushing for rights for women. So one of the things that they pushed for in 1972 is the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, okay? And basically this amendment says exactly this: equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by the state on the account of sex. So the Equal Rights Amendment is passed by Congress and it's sent to the states. My dog might be joining me here. Anyways, it's sent to the states. Okay, remember, if you remember constitutional law from Gov, an amendment to become ratified requires 2/3 of the states to ratify it. So the other thing about the Equal Rights Amendment, which is interesting because typically they don't do this and it's not a requirement, is Congress put a time frame on how long, how many years it would be given before the Equal Rights Amendment would expire if not enough states had ratified it. So by the expiration date in the 1970s, it was 3 states short of the 38 states that were required in order to ratify it. In 2019, just prior to the end of the year, it finally hit the 38th state to ratify it. But the problem is the timetable has passed. So, and a lot of states that said that ratified it in the past have now reversed their decision on it. It's a highly controversial amendment, and so it's never been added to the Constitution. Could it be added to the Constitution one day? Maybe. It's hard to tell. The other big thing in women's rights is Title IX, which is another thing that's passed as an amendment to the Civil Rights Bill in the 1970s. And basically it forbids gender discrimination and any kind of federally funded education program, especially when it comes to athletics at the college level. So it basically means that colleges have to offer comparable opportunities to women. They don't have to allow females to join like a football team or a wrestling team, though some have done that, okay? And it doesn't mean that they have to have the exact number of women on the basketball team as they do men on the basketball team. But they have to make opportunities available for both male and female students at the college level, okay? So if you're offering some type of program to men, you have to offer, the law says, something substantially proportionate to the other gender, okay? And they also have to work to try to expand opportunities for women on campus, okay? So that's what Title IX did. Anytime you see someone that's like any college has this position, but like a Title IX coordinator, it's that person's job to ensure that women are really seeing equal access at the college level. Prior to this, you had female collegiate sports, but they weren't given hardly any funding. And this kind of solved that, because if you don't follow Title IX, well, then you as a country lose your, or not you as a country, you as a college lose your funding. And that's a real problem. Okay, so now let's move on to the LGBT movement, okay? So one of the things that's hardly covered in textbooks, and I don't really understand why, is the Lavender Scare during the 1950s. And it's coincided with the Red Scare, the second Red Scare in the 1950s, and McCarthyism. So while McCarthy is going after communists, which is what often takes up the history textbooks, he also, along with several other people in government, decides to go after homosexuals in government, or gay people in government. And hence why it's also called the Lavender Scale. Scare, excuse me. It's then added to when President Eisenhower signs Executive Order 10450, and again, you don't need to know that specific number, which basically says that homosexuals are a security risk in government, and as a result, they need to be removed from government and fired. So any gay person that works for the federal government, yeah, they need to be fired. And about 5,000 people ended up losing their job for being accused of being gay. Now, why do you think Eisenhower said this is a security risk? What do you think was his reasoning for saying that gay people were a security risk in the federal government? It could have been communist. You're close. You're really close. Spies, that's another good thing. Nope. It's because that the government worried that these people who were gay, especially if they were closeted, could be blackmailed. And if they were working in some type of sensitive position, which basically at that point they considered everything sensitive because they were so worried about the communists, that they would be a security risk to the United States. Because if they were blackmailed and someone was basically holding over their head, like, look, if you don't tell me X, I'm going to tell the whole world that you're gay, then that was the security concern, okay? And so as a result, all these thousands of people who were accused of being gay were removed from the federal government and lost their jobs as a result. And so that was the Lavender Scare. So one side of government, you were getting rid of supposed communists, which really were not the case. And on the other side, you were getting rid of gay persons. So the movement for LGBT Americans really does kick off with the Stonewall Riot in 1969. So the Stonewall Inn in New York City, it's still there today. It's still a club today. Was a nightclub for gay persons, which was illegal in of itself at the time in New York. But state law threatened bars with the loss of their liquor license, which allows you to serve alcoholic beverages, if they allowed same-sex dancing or if they allowed men to wear women's clothing. And so basically in June of 1969, exactly, we just hit the 50th anniversary last year. In June of 1969, the police raided the Stonewall Inn. Unlike other raids, because this was not something that was not uncommon at the time, unlike other raids, though, people fought back. And it launched a massive protest movement around the United States. The Gay Liberation Front was launched as a result. And they began to win a series of victories in the 1970s. The American Psychological Association, the APA, finally removed homosexuality as a mental illness from the DSM. At the end of the decade, almost all the states in the United States had repealed their sodomy statutes, which sodomy is just sex with a person of the same gender. And then in 1980, the Democrats actually added a gay rights plank to their platform. And so all of these things are really as a result of the catalyst of the Stonewall Riot. Finally, we'll talk about the American Indian movement. So in the 1950s, the Eisenhower administration really made an unsuccessful attempt to encourage American Indians to leave reservations and to assimilate into urban America, okay? That should sound familiar because we've seen that happen before, remember? If we go back a little bit in American history, what act in American history basically got rid of the one big reservation policy, especially like in Oklahoma, and tried to force Native Americans to assimilate? You remember what the name of that act was? It's really, really, really important to know. What was the act that got rid of the one big reservation policy for Native Americans? Yeah, Rylan, you're correct. The Dawes Act, okay? And so as a result of that, no more reservations for Indians. And then also it opened Oklahoma up for settlement by whites, and basically was the closing of the frontier and pushed Native Americans to assimilate. Remember, you had the Carlisle Indian School and all that kind of stuff. Well, Eisenhower now, let's see, this would have been like 60, 70 years after the Dawes Act. Again, it's pushing Indians to leave the reservation and assimilate into urban America, okay? So that's exactly what he tries. It doesn't work, okay? American Indian leaders really resisted the loss of their cultural identity, and so they ended up forming what was called the American Indian Movement, or AIM, in 1968. They took a couple militant actions around the United States to push their agenda and to basically bring it to the attention of the world. Like, hey, stop screwing us over. We are people too, and basically have been screwed over by treaty after treaty and law after law over the last 400 years. So one of the things they did was they actually took over the abandoned prison of Alcatraz in the San Francisco Bay. And then they also occupied Wounded Knee in South Dakota, which of course you should remember from earlier this year, the Wounded Knee massacre. And both of those things brought national attention because they went on for days and days and days to the American Indian movement. Finally, as a result, in 1975, Congress passed the Indian Self-Determination Act, which gave reservations and tribal lands greater control of their own governance, of their own education, of their own law enforcement. Basically, no longer would the United States government control these individual reservations. The Indians on the reservations would have the authority to control them themselves. So those are the big things that you need to know about civil rights for these three groups for the 1950s and 60s, okay? There are other things that happened with women's rights and especially the gay rights movement in the 1980s and 90s, even 2000s that you'll get in later in period 8 and 9 that are also going to be important. Okay, guys, well, enjoy your break. Thanks for taking some time this morning to check in with me. So you know how to get a hold of me if you need me. See ya.